Great. So now it's my great honor to introduce our very special guest. Stefan Helmreich is professor of anthropology at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge in the US. Professor Helmreich studied how scientists in oceanography, biology, acoustics, and computer science define and theorize their objects of study, particularly as these objects, waves, light, sound, and code, reach their conceptual limits. Stefan Helmreich is the author of several well-noticed and award-winning books, including Alien Ocean, Sounding the Limits of Life, and the most recent, A Book of Waves, which this lecture is primarily centered around. So now we are, of course, very curious to hear much more about this. So it's about time that I leave the word to our speaker, Professor Stefan Helmreich. Warmly welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Caroline, and thank you, Cecilia, so much for this invitation. And it's really wonderful to be here virtually with all of you, zooming in from over the other side of the ocean. I guess I'll get right to it in interest of leaving enough time to discuss things. And this is drawn from my book. I don't know if you can see me, but it's drawn from A Book of Waves, which is my recent publication on wave science, which is both an ethnography and a cultural study of all the ways that waves have been imaged and imagined in sciences, arts, and humanities, and posthumanities, as it were. So just to begin, seeing the sea as a feminine force and flux has a storied history in the cross-currents of Judeo-Christian thought, Enlightenment philosophy, and natural science epistemology. The ocean has been motherly amnion, fluid matrix, seductive siren, and unruly tide. These castings have opposed principles of masculine monogenetic procreative power, ordering rationality, and self-securing independence and dominion over the biophysical world. At other moments, the ocean has been masculine, the embodiment of Poseidon, or Yahweh, or the virile power of storms and vigorous hydrotherapy. Ocean waves, icons of rhythmic and predictable motion, as well as of chaos and destruction, have been similarly gendered, though most often as kinds of women. The gendering of waves is intriguing to think about at a moment when the humanities have turned toward the material world to make sense of domains beyond the human, the posthuman, multi-species, and non-human. With the arrival of conversations about vibrant matter, scholars have written of the ocean as a site of wet ontologies, a zone of three-dimensional and turbulent materiality. That's Philip Steinberg and Kimberly Peterson. Traces of the human still haunt such ahumanisms, particularly in the time of the Anthropocene. Timothy Morton calls Anthropocenic objects such as the globe and climate hyperobjects, phenomena that exist on massive scales. Such objects are viscous, non-local, temporally undulating, and phasing, which I think describes waves in many ways. Viscous, non-local, temporally undulating, and phasing. The scale at which hyperobjects operate would seem far from the arenas in which gender is relevant, or even individual waves, though at scale these are certainly viscous, non-local, temporally undulating, and phasing. But, as Judith Butler notes in Bodies That Matter, the notion of matter, at least in languages tangled up with Latin, has been densely figured as female, as matrix, as mater, an inheritance difficult fully to escape. More, the ocean has been framed itself as a kind of mother. That said, gendered castings of the sea have always been unstable. Gender is a concept, as Donna Haraway writes, quote, to contest the naturalization of sexual difference, unquote, and employed in concert with race, class, and other analytics to decode how inequalities manifest across human selves. But it may also be adapted to upturn the assignation of sex, sexuality, and other genres of difference to non-human entities. More, today's gender-bent waves might be signs of how the analytic of gender is itself viscous, undulating, and phasing, is at sea. The essayist Jonathan Raban writes, quote, of all natural symbols, the breaking wave is the most laden with suggestive meanings. For several thousand years, the waves have been talking power and sex and death to us, unquote. It may not be a surprise then that waves, at least in the West, which is the parochial focus of what I'm speaking about here, have spoken in symbolisms of sex and gender. In male fantasies, Klaus Taylorwhite offers examples of how invocations of watery flow have been filtered through masculinist anxieties, forms that have made waves into a curl of subaltern feminine imagery. He writes, quote, "A river without end, enormous and wide, flows through the world's literatures. Over and over again, the woman in the water, woman as a storming, cavorting, cooling ocean, a raging stream, a waterfall, as a limitless body of water that ships pass through, women as the enticing or perilous deep, as a cup of bubbling bodily fluids, the vagina as wave, as foam, love as the foam from the collision of two waves, as a sea voyage." Tara Rogers, unquote. Tara Rogers argues that waveform inscriptions, which represent waves as curvilinear form, so think of kind of outlines of waves as kind of these curving lineages, tame what Elizabeth Gross names as, quote, "a formlessness that engulfs all form, a disorder that threatens all order," unquote. Drawing on Luce Irigaray, who observes that, quote, "historically the properties of fluids have been abandoned to the feminine," unquote, Rogers suggests that natural philosophy ideologies in the West have had waves as, quote, "both form-giving and perpetually in excess of formal representation," unquote. So I'm really interested in that way that waves are both things that give form and are also constantly in excess of that form. So, where to begin the historical investigation of the gendering of waves? Perhaps following the feminist theologian Catherine Keller with the Bible. In The Face of the Deep, A Theology of Becoming, Keller argues that patristic Christian readings of Genesis have interpreted the void introduced in verse 1-2 of the book of Genesis, quote, "And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep," unquote, as either a nothingness from which God created the cosmos ex nihilo, or as a chaotic fluid and maternal principle tamed by a masculine God. The deep, which is Tehom in Hebrew, Keller observes, derives from Tiamat, the Babylonian goddess of the ocean, a motherly principle subsumed into the syncretic biblical creation tale. What happened, asked Keller, quote, "to the chaos of Genesis 1-2? Was it murdered? Was it a she?" Unquote. Keller writes that, quote, "the void evinces fullness, its waters viscosity. The second verse sends a mysterious tremor through the whole narrative of creation," unquote. For early Christian writers, quote, "the Tehomic alterity, the alterity of Tiamat, the Babylonian goddess, which has been relegated to the outer darkness, threatens to flow back monstrously. The flux, repressed, returns as the flood," unquote. Noah's flood survives as the excess of creation, with waves the echoing substance of that inundation, a flood that God keeps at bay. In the book of Job, God describes his power over the seas, quote, "Here you may come, but no farther. Here your proud waves break," unquote, at the boundary of the land. The 4th century bishop Basil of Caesarea wrote that at the moment when the sea meets the land, it, quote, "withdraws out of respect, bowing its waves as if to worship the Lord who has appointed its limits," unquote. Waves are at one moment defiant agents of disorder and at another pious believers. Waves gather a gendered agency in another tradition of thinking the supernatural. In Old Norse mythology, the 9 daughters of Aegir, god of the sea, and Ran, goddess of the drowned, are ocean waves, and each manifests a different wavy form. In the Prose Edda by the Icelandic poet Snorri Sturluson, compiled around 1200 Common Era, these daughters are named Hemliviga, that through which one can see the heaven, Dufa, the pitching one, Blodigada, the bloody hair, Hefring, riser, Udir, frothing wave, Hron, welling wave, Bilgja, billow, Bara, foam fleck, Kolga, the cool one. In Norse stories, these wave maidens afflict seafarers by embodying their father's force and their mother's mercilessness. Judy Quinn writes in the Edda stanzas in which, quote, names are deployed, the personified wave is ascribed agency, and often rather willful agency. Female personifications of the sea are imagined as nubile, alluring, self-willed, determinative, and destructive, unquote. Quinn gives a sample in which wave maidens vex male sailors. Quote, who are those brides who go along in the surf skerries and have their journey along the fjord? They have a hard bed, the white-hooded ones, and they play little in the calm. Who are those women who go around together? Seldom are they gentle with the band of men, and they are awakened in the wind. Who are those women who go sorrowing to the curiosity of their father? They have pale hair, the white-hooded ones, and those women do not have husbands, unquote. These are scary women. To Barbara Ehrenreich, such manifestations give body to a masculinist dread of, quote, a nameless feminine force that seeks to engulf, described over and over as a flood, a tide, a threat that comes in waves, unquote. In a later tale, the wave women are mothers of Helmdar, a Norse god who keeps watch for Ragnarok, the world-ending battle among the gods in Eddic eschatology. W.C.G. Collingwood's woodcut, Heimdall and his 9 mothers, which is pictured here, envisions the maidens as embodied water. The wave maidens move from stern temptresses to maternal protective figures. So there's multiplicities of femininities that are kind of coursing through the wave imagery here. The Tide Rises, the Tide Falls, a poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, poses waves as delicate carriers of mournful news about the evanescence of life. The poem goes like this. The little waves, with their soft white hands, efface the footprints in the sands, and the tide rises, the tide falls, unquote. Waves offer a durable deliquescence, one supported here by a whiteness that may also animate a racialized femininity. Compare this with Hortense Spillers on One Oceanic Trajectory for the Making of Blackness, in which Hortense Spillers writes, quote, African persons in the Middle Passage were literally suspended in the oceanic, captured in an undifferentiated identity that made them ungendered flesh, unquote. For audiences at the start of the 20th century, the whiteness of wave women went hand in glove with their anthropomorphization as individuals. White wave women steer me toward a perhaps unexpected connection, the permanent wave hairstyle. After World War I, many white American middle-class women found their lives transformed as new social possibilities emerged, a result of the shortage of male labor during the war, or after the war. On the path to a new interdependence and independence supported by well-paid office jobs and a sense of the possibility of suffrage, many women signaled modern status with short hairstyles, such as the bob, at once practical and radical. But, quote, simple haircuts for women never gained acceptance in the 1920s, at least among the men and women who publicly expressed their opinions, unquote. Commentators worried that short hair risked blurring the differences between the sexes. But in the late 1920s, a new technology emerged to offer, quote, feminine and graceful styles with curls and waves, unquote, to short hair. The permanent wave delivered, quote, new curlier versions of bobbed hair, marking the reestablishment of gender distinctions in fashionable self-presentation, unquote. Wavy short hair could re-feminize white women. A joke in a 1926 issue of the farmers magazine Northwest Poultry Journal quipped, quote, the ocean must be feminine. Anyway, it early adopted the permanent wave, unquote. World War II saw a state-led rescripting of women's possible identities in line with the figure of the soldier citizen. With many young men away at the front, the military turned to women to fill jobs as engineers, doctors, cryptographers, attorneys, clerical workers, and officers. In 1942, the U.S. Navy founded the Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, or WAVES, placing women in temporary shoreside naval jobs so that men in these positions might be sent to sea. The association of waves with evanescence and femininity would not have been lost on many publics. But waves also summoned the image of a wave of attack, a more battle-ready meaning. They called up the symbolism both masculine and feminine. Indeed, women in this organization were meant, in the most heteronormative way, to be both feminine and masculine, idealized in 1943 as, quote, trim girls in the smart navy blue uniform with its mixture of the romantic and the functional, unquote. The waves, numbering 86,000 at war's end, were overwhelmingly white, meant to stand for a vanguard for traditional American femininity, though also, at moments, for sea changes in gender relations. Consider the figure of waves of feminism, meant to point to fronts of social change. In the US context, the first wave came to refer to suffrage movements, in the second, to 1960s women's liberation, and the third to women of color and queer feminism of the 1980s and 1990s. Many critics, however, have pointed to the limitations of the wave metaphor, not least its original anchoring in the experience of mostly middle-class white women. Edney K. Garrison argues that the feminist oceanography, a term coined in 1997 by Deborah Siegel, of the wave narrative homogenizes women, linearizes movement, and posits times of lulls, mismeasuring histories of activism. Alison Wiley is more sanguine about the possibility of the metaphor, suggesting that waves do not so much overtake and succeed, quote, one another, as rise and fall again and again in the same place, transmitting and diffusing energy in complicated ways, unquote. Waves, like genders, are malleable things. The defiance of waves gathers a secular cast in Friedrich Nietzsche's The Gay Science, in which they become emissaries of unrepentant modernity. Quote, Nietzsche writes, quote, how greedily this wave approaches, as if it were after something, how it crawls with terrifying haste into the inmost nooks of this labyrinthine cliff. But already another wave is approaching, still more greedily and savagely than the first, and its soul, too, seems to be full of secrets and the lust to dig up treasures. Thus live waves, thus live we who will, unquote. Eugen Victor Wolfenstein argues that these waves embody a Nietzschean valorization of a masculine will to power. Nietzsche's waves have an affinity, too, with Greek mythological renderings of waves as horses. As Tamara Andrews writes, quote, wave crests resembled the horse's billowing manes. Breakers, or particularly strong waves, were sometimes referred to as wild bulls, unquote. Wave horses are usually masculine and white, but not always. Here are becoming animal waves in Virginia Woolf's The Waves. Quote, the waves drummed on the shore like turbaned warriors, like turbaned men with poison agassiz, who whirling their arms on high advance upon the feeding flocks, the white sheep. They fell with a regular thud. They fell with the concussions of horses' hooves on the turf, unquote. Robin Hackett argues that this moment in Virginia Woolf is an anti-imperialist parody of colonial fantasies about precious white womanhood under threat from dark alterity. Quote, the words assegai and turbaned mark these figures as dark-skinned others. The use of warriors as opposed to soldiers primitivizes them. Waves become dark, animal, masculine, other to a domestic, imperiled, sheepish white femininity. Flip the script, though, and look to Nnedi Okorafor's African futurist novelist Lagoon. Set on the oil-poisoned shores of Nigeria, where a shape-shifting crew of formidable aliens arrive to use their powers of material transformation and reorganization to cleanse the sea of petropollution. The extraterrestrials' first envoy, Ayodele, comes to a beach in Lagos in a form both science-fictionally and rhetorically and folklorically familiar to the people she meets, as a molecular machine and phasing in and out of being, quote, a dark-skinned African woman with long black braids diving like Mami Wata, unquote, a West African water deity. Ayodele arrives as a wave, barreling toward a trio who will be the main characters of our novel. Quote, something was happening with the ocean. The waves were roiling irregularly. Each time the waves broke on the beach, they reached farther and farther up the sand. Then a 4-foot wave rose up. The wave was heading right for them. Flash, unquote. It was, quote, a wave that looked like the hand of a powerful water spirit, unquote. Melody Jew argues that this wave condenses Afro-diasporic figurations of the sea as both a harbinger of kidnapping terror and as part of an African futurist's, quote, speculations that figure the ocean as both a means of cultural survival and as a catalyst for future evolution, a familiar alterity, unquote. So, where might this itinerary from Genesis to these many wave anthropomorphisms, zoomorphisms, and theomorphisms arrive? Let me return to Keller's theological project in Face of the Deep, tuned to recapturing, remaking the face of the deep, not as an essentialist feminine energy or the reanimation of Tiamat, but as what Keller calls, with a nod to Donna Haraway, quote, a trickster matrix, unquote. Committed to a, quote, queer, post-colonial, polymorphous, and possibly perverse feminism, unquote, Keller writes about a reimagined Tehom, a reimagined Tiamat. Quote, as the wave rolls into realization, it may, with an uncomfortable passion, fold its relations into its future. These relations, the waves of our possibility, comprise the real potentiality from which we emerge. Keller moves waves into an animal idiom, now calling not upon the horse-like or the equine, but the cetacean. Quote, we are drops of an oceanic impersonality. We arch like waves, like porpoises, unquote. This swerve to porpoises may spiral back to old-school gender symbolism, since these creatures are sometimes described as distillations of hydrodynamic femininity. But it may open up a different becoming animate materiality. Keller writes, too, that, quote, waves are membranes of energy from which matter forms and stabilizes, unquote. Waves transition between states of energy operating across matter, gender, and species. Mel Chen's writings on transgender theory suggest a rereading of the prefix trans. They write, quote, trans is not a linear space of mediation between two monolithic autonomous poles. I wish to highlight a prefixial trans, not primarily limited to gender, unquote. So, thinking of waves' entanglement with gender and animality, we can call waves tranimals, adapting a term defined by Lindsay Kelly to describe species, sexuality, and semiosis crossing creatures. And think here also of the work of Ava Hayward. If attention to the materiality of the non-human world, including materials, toxins, and water, may be key to accounts of the animacy of the world, then waves exhibit a tranimate, becoming tranimate objects. Astrida Nimanis suggests in her piece Hydrofeminism, or On Becoming a Body of Water, that feminist analyses of water politics should step away from essentialist identifications of women with water, but not ignore such sex-gender water eddies as the travel of chemical estrogens through oceans and bodies, or to take an allied example that, quote, North American breast milk likely harbors DDT, PCBs, dioxin, trichloroethylene, unquote. The waves of Tehom, or of the creation, may be good for thinking with and against gender. In Has the Queer Ever Been Human? Donna Luciano and Mel Chen offer that, quote, the encounter with the inhuman expands the term queer past its conventional resonance with a container for human sexual non-normativities, forcing us to ask once again what sex and gender might look like apart from the anthropocentric forms with which we have become perhaps too familiar, unquote. Thinking about sex and gender as they are assigned and undone with respect to non-humans, as chaotic nature, trickster God, waves, flows of marine chemistries, might render the analytic of gender freshly at sea, as Mother Ocean becomes not other ocean, but ocean otherwise, a genre-bending tranimate transoceanic. And suddenly I'm done. I realize that was a bit shorter, but I think that will give us a bit more time for discussion, and I hope that worked.
That's absolutely marvelous. Thank you so much, Stefan. What an odyssey. What a tour de force. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the invitation.